Hey, it's me, Quence, and I'm here today to deliver to you my personal top 10 TV shows of 2024. These are my favorite brand new series premieres from the past year. And I'm going to say right up front, I thought this was an excellent year for television. Normally, I don't get to watch as many TV shows as I do movies, and sometimes I even have to work a little bit to fill out a top 10 TV shows list. This year, that was not the case. I had too many TV shows. I had to work to narrow it down, and normally I don't do any honorable mentions or anything like that for my TV shows list. This year I am going to do that at the end. So there was a lot to watch, a lot of really fun, good content, I thought, and now you're going to get to hear me talk about it. That's going to kick off with two special awards. Actually, it's just one special award, but I'm giving it out to two different shows. And that award is for show that was really good, but wasn't technically actually a new show. First, that award's going to X-Men 97. For my money, this is the best X-Men adaptation to date. This is the ideal of how I want to see the X-Men depicted on screen. They get every single aspect of it right. The action, the use of the powers, the characters' personalities, their dynamics on the team. It's fun, it's exciting, it's funny, but it also doesn't shy away from the dramatic, disturbing, upsetting aspects of X-Men lore. It's not afraid to dive into any aspect of X-Men lore. This show gets weird. They talk about strange cosmic stuff and deep kind of lore about characters that a casual X-Men fan doesn't really know about, but you will know about them if you watched the first 5 seasons of the 90s animated X-Men show, which this is, even though they gave it a new title, essentially a new season in. It picks up right where it left off, and man, it is far better than that show ever was. I think, again, this is better than any of the X-Men movies. I absolutely loved this show. I can't wait for more of it. But it couldn't go on my top 10 list, you see, because it's really a season 6, not a season 1, even though they want you to believe that. And the other show getting this same award from me is True Detective Night Country, which is kind of a new show, but not really, because it's a season 4 of True Detective, but it's an anthology show and they gave it a subtitle for some reason, so it sort of feels new-ish. A lot of people really didn't like this for some reason. Especially it seems big True Detective fans. I'm not a big True Detective fan. I only watched the first season, which I thought was excellent, and I totally skipped out on seasons 2 and 3 for whatever reason. This is the one that I decided to jump back in on, and I thought it was awesome. Jodie Foster is awesome, and the whole thing has this very The Thing-esque vibe, taking place in a cold, wintry place with weird, mysterious shenanigans occurring. As many have pointed out, if you really examine the mysteries and the logic of them, everything might not quite all add up, but I don't care. I just thought the vibes and the atmosphere was 100% on point. And that's why it got this special award. But now I'm going to talk about my actual top 10 TV shows of 2024, beginning the list with number 10. Number 10 is Sugar. This is a noir-style detective show starring Colin Farrell. He is a PI who helps find missing people in LA. Pretty typical kind of a setup for a noir detective show. Not that I have anything against that. There aren't too many of these made these days, and I'm perfectly happy to see a solid mystery executed in a familiar but satisfying way in a modern day setting. Of course, this show is very typical up until it isn't. And I am not going to say what that means or what occurs because I don't want to give anything away at all if you're lucky enough to not have heard about this show just yet. But there are some big events that occur towards the latter half of the series that completely change your perspective of what is going on in the story. And sometimes when a show takes a big swing like that and shifts in such a dramatic way, that's not going to work for everybody. For me, it totally worked. It made me love the show more than if it had just been what it already was, which was, again, just a solid, fun noir mystery. Your mileage may vary, but it's only 6 or 7 episodes, the series, so personally, I recommend giving it a shot if this sounds like it's possibly your cup of tea at all. Colin Farrell is really entertaining as this straight-laced, weird, mysterious guy that loves noir movies, and he does this old-fashioned noir monologue throughout the show, but it's kind of a little bit meta in that he also is a fan of this stuff, so he's acknowledging it in his work, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but not too much. And there's a lot of great actors in smaller roles that you'll find here that are a lot of fun. And discovering that mystery of what is going on with this guy, why is he kind of weird, and who is trying to stop him from finding the person that he's trying to find and what actually did happen to her. It's a good watch, so check out Sugar. Next is number 9 on my list, Baby Reindeer. This is a mini-series based on a play, which was based on a true story, a thing that actually happened to the guy who wrote and performed in the original play, and then created this show based on it. The main character is a struggling comedian in England who starts to be stalked by this woman who becomes enamored with him. And then the question becomes, how much of it is her being a stalker, and how much of it is maybe him kind of, in a weird way, actually enjoying the attention? And where does that line get drawn? It's a fascinating show because you're examining these two characters who are both very flawed. Like, obviously, the woman doing the stalking is not someone you're necessarily gonna be rooting for. But maybe in some aspects of the show, you can also understand where she's coming from and sympathize with her, or at least pity her. And the same goes for the main character. He's not the best guy in the world either. In fact, he might be kind of a jerk. But probably you are hoping that he doesn't get stalked or violently abused in any way. As I said, he also plays a failed comedian, and you get to see some clips, some portions of his stand-up sets, which I assume are based on real things he did in real life. And you see in the show very few people responding to them or thinking that they're funny. And often I actually did think they were really funny. And I thought the show really nailed that aspect of displaying comedy that is supposed to be failing, but you can still tell that the guy who's performing it actually is funny, which is really hard to pull off, I think. I think it's hard to pull off good stand-up comedy that's scripted on a TV show that an actual stand-up isn't performing. I think it's also can be painful and uncomfortable to see what's supposed to be bad stand-up that often comes across as just boring or unbelievable in how bad it is. And this is just perfectly funny, but also a little bit too weird that you can tell why it wouldn't translate for all audiences. This is not an aspect of the show that most people will probably focus on, but I thought it was cool. Overall, this is just the epitome of bingeable TV. Very entertaining, very suspenseful, not afraid to get dark. Number 8 on my list. Nobody Wants This is the name of this next show. It's essentially a romantic comedy between Kristen Bell and Adam Brody, two people that I love. Adam Brody plays a rabbi, and Kristen Bell doesn't. And the two of them meet and start dating, and wouldn't you know it, their different cultures and lived experiences create some conflict. This is another example of kind of a familiar premise playing out in a way that is still really entertaining. It's very Apatow-y, I would say. If you're familiar with movies like knocked up 40-year-old virgin. It has that kind of flavor to it. And I loved that because that's not something we see too much of anymore. In fact, 10 years ago, this show probably would have been a movie, but comedies and romantic comedies even just don't get as much play in theaters anymore, and now that's going to TV, and I'm fine with that if the result is shows like this, which I really liked. Beyond the two leads just being really likable and funny, there are a lot of really funny moments in the show, a lot of them fueled by the references to Judaism, Jewish culture, and how that plays for someone who is not involved in that world. As a person who was raised Jewish, I'm not religious, but seeing those things represented on screen was kind of funny and fun for me. Surprisingly, there aren't that many shows or movies that really do show it in this way, unless you're watching Schindler's List or something real serious like that. There aren't that many characters in or movies or shows about just Jewish people living their lives. And maybe this show leans a little bit into the stereotypes of it, but I didn't think it was tasteless or anything like that. I thought it was really funny. And it's a genuinely romantic show. Easy watching. Plus, Kristen Bell plays a podcaster. That's her profession. So they also talk about podcasting. Judaism and podcasting. It's like they made this show for me. Nobody wants this. That's my number 8. Number 7 on my list is One Day. Another Netflix show and also another romantic comedy, essentially. And I'll repeat myself, I think if this was 10, 15 years ago, this is the kind of thing you would be more likely to see as a movie, and here we are seeing it as a show. In fact, years ago they did make a movie of this that I don't think anyone liked. They're both based on the same book, and here it is as a mini-series. The concept is, it is two people that meet, a boy and a girl. Could I make it any more obvious? But the twist of the show is that every single episode takes place on the same one day, 1 year apart. So you are just seeing that one day each year and where these two characters are at in their lives. And often they're both in the episode together. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're doing two separate things because, you know, it would be a pretty big coincidence if they were together every single year and weren't necessarily dating during all of that time. The show takes place over the course of several years, so you really get to see how these two people go through things. And I thought they did a great job convincing you that the characters were gradually aging and changing, and the process of how they get from point A to point B to C in their lives felt very natural and believable. It's kind of the ultimate will they, won't they story. And if that's not your jam, if you're not really into the romance of it all, then this one might not work for you. But I thought it was very beautiful, very moving. I haven't seen the movie, but I can't imagine that it was done nearly as well because it really feels like this one needed that episodic format in order to breathe and be done properly. Remember Colin Farrell? He's back in penguin form. The Penguin is number 6 on my list. The spin-off of Matt Reeves' The Batman movie. This one is all about that rascally penguin in Gotham City wreaking havoc, trying to climb his way to the top of the crime ladder. Yes, this show takes place in the same universe as The Batman, but it really doesn't matter. Outside of the fact that he is called the Penguin, and that they reference Gotham City and Arkham Asylum and a couple other small characters from the Batman universe, this show really could stand completely on its own, and if you didn't know about Batman, you could easily walk away from this not ever having a clue that they were related to each other whatsoever. I actually really like that. Coming off of so many Marvel TV shows where it feels like they are trying so hard to squeeze in references to every other aspect of the franchise, but at the same time, they're limited because they can't always pay to get those actors or those locations or objects to fit in, and also it's complicated because they're juggling 45 different balls in the air at one time. I like that this show just says, no, we're just gonna make a good mob show first and foremost that just happens to be about a guy called the Penguin, and go with it. Colin Farrell is unbelievable in this makeup. You truly can barely ever tell that it's him, but he does an awesome job, as does Kristen Milioti, who plays his sort of crime rival in the underworld of Gotham. She really steals the show almost. She almost does. That's how good she is, but it is hard to get away from Colin Farrell in the Penguin makeup, which is just so dominating. I loved them both. It's a tricky thing, I think, to make a show about a villain from the get-go, because you have to decide, are you going to try to humanize this guy? Are we supposed to root for the Penguin, or do we just think he's a nasty, disgusting guy that we don't like and we're hoping Batman comes in and beats him up soon? And the show definitely plays with that expectation. Do you root for this guy? Do you like him? Do you feel bad for him? Did he get a bad rap? Especially because this is a new version of the Batman universe, so they can play around with that. You don't really know what type of person this particular Penguin is, but you will find out over the course of this season. It goes to some dark places. I think I actually like this show more than I liked the Batman movie. And it's going to be interesting to see how they incorporate Penguin back into the sequel to the Batman, now that I've spent far more time with that character than I actually did with Bruce Wayne. Kind of an odd thing, we'll see, but regardless, this one is worth watching whether or not you care about comic books. Number 5 on my list is Presumed Innocent. This show was based on a book, and there was also a Harrison Ford movie made based on this in the 90s, which I haven't seen and I haven't read the book, so it was all new to me, about a guy who is a prosecutor, and he is accused of murdering a woman that he worked with and was also having an affair with. If you like legal dramas of any kind, you gotta get in on this show. It is so riveting. They do such a good job laying out the pieces of the puzzle. I thought the first episode or two was a little bit slow as they're just starting to introduce everything, but once the show kicks off, it kicks off and never lets up. And you are really going to have to watch the entire show to decide whether or not you think the main character, played by Jake Gyllenhaal, is innocent or guilty of the crime. The show, every time you think that maybe they're telling you something happened, then they show you something else, a different perspective, a new piece of evidence that makes you question everything that you learned previously. It's really smart, and that's a hard thing to do in a 2-hour movie, let alone an 8-episode TV series. To keep that ball in the air for that long, people might come away with it with different impressions, and maybe they'll have always thought this guy was guilty or have always thought that this guy was innocent, depending on what they bring to it. But for me, I thought it was a really good back and forth where I was never quite sure what was going on or who I believed or who I trusted. It almost has a Zodiac vibe going on, which of course Jake Gyllenhaal was also in, where there's just something thrilling about following the process of this case. I don't know exactly how accurate or realistic it is to the real law, probably not very, but it felt true in many aspects, or at least more true than a lot of these types of crime dramas tend to. Gripping, riveting television. Now we get to number 4 on my list of best shows of 2024, for which I must go against the title because I will not say nothing. I will in fact say things about Say Nothing. This is a show that takes place in the 70s in Ireland during a period of time known as the Troubles. You're probably smarter than I am and maybe a better student of history, so you may have known more about this than I did going in, but this was a period of time in which the Irish Republican Army was formed to fight against the British who were taking over the country. And hey, if there's one thing that the Americans and the Irish can get together in support of, it's sticking it to the British. Am I right? I said that the show takes place in the 70s, but actually it takes place over multiple decades. You go all the way up until the 90s. In fact, there's kind of this framing device wherein the characters telling the story are the older versions of themselves, finally giving away all their secrets into a microphone after all these years later. And we are finding out what all those secrets are. This series was based on a book, which is based on real people. So while of course I'm sure things are embellished and changed here and there, this is based on real events, real characters. The names have not been changed to protect the innocent. The book only came out in 2018. I didn't read it, but watching this show feels like you are learning vital, exciting, fascinating, harrowing stuff that is true and important. It mainly focuses on the character of Dolores Price and her sister, and the things that they did in the army and the things that they endured as a result of that, some of which were arguably heroic, some of which were arguably horrific. I think it's safe to say that they are the protagonists of the show, and in that sense, the show does paint the IRA in a more positive light. They are essentially, I think, painted as the heroes of the show, but that doesn't mean that they're portrayed as perfect angels, and it's not shown that there are things that they did that they regret that probably weren't the best things to do. But hey, that's what happens when you're at war. People on both sides do great things and terrible things, and there aren't really any winners because everybody has to put themselves into the muck. From my biased perspective, I loved rooting for these guys. I love that there is a show about so-called terrorists trying to kick out an oppressive regime from their country who is actively oppressing and murdering their people. Feels relevant to today somehow. I'm not going to go into specifics, but I bet there's somewhere you can find a parallel to that happening in the real world right now. Just a hunch. I feel like if you looked, you could find it. So I loved that about the show, but even then, even I had to take a look at some of the things they did and go, yeah, maybe they went a little too far in some places, you know? It's an awesome show for all those reasons, particularly a couple of episodes. There's an arc in the middle that I thought was the peak of it. That's some of the best TV episodes I've ever seen. Plus, you get a lot of great Irish music and you get to hear some great Irish accents. Even if they're kind of hard to understand sometimes, you may want to put on subtitles for this one. Number 3 on my list is Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Are we noticing a trend yet? This is yet another TV show that was once a film. But who goes to see movies anymore? TV is where things are happening, and Mr. and Mrs. Smith wasn't even a particularly good or beloved movie. I don't think too many people are talking about that anymore. Here we have a new telling of it, starring Donald Glover and Maya Erskine. And if Donald Glover is involved in a TV show, there's a very strong chance it's going to end up in my top 10 at the end of the year. And that happened. Now, I said that this show was a retelling of the Mr. and Mrs. Smith movie. That's not really an accurate statement. It takes that initial premise, which is that there are two secret agents that are paired up in a marriage together and do secret agent stuff. But that's really about as far as those similarities go. This show focuses much more heavily on the relationship between the two characters. It kind of is another romantic comedy, an action romance comedy, I guess. It's all of those things. And some of the best moments, some of the best episodes of the show are just focusing on the relationship between the two of them and their general getting to know each other vibe. Now, they are married in the show for the purposes of their job, but they're really in reality just getting to know each other. So it's a very interesting dynamic. You get to see them completely thrown into living together, working together, spending all their time together. And how does that affect this kind of honeymoon period of the relationship? Obviously, because the two main actors are really funny, the show is really funny. They just have a lot of witty banter back and forths with each other. But there's also a really fun, cool spy mystery going on. They go out on different missions and they're being directed by a secret organization, and you don't really know what that organization is up to or what their end goals are. And there's this great dramatic device where if they mess up too many times, something bad might happen. They only have so many strikes, so they have to be really careful on these missions, which gives it a lot of great tension every single time, because if they screw up one thing, you don't know what's going to happen. Because of the fun trappings of that mystery setting and because of the amazing chemistry between those two leads, this was one of my favorite shows of the year, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, and I'm looking forward to season 2. But number 2 on my list this year goes to Ripley. This is an adaptation of the book, The Talented Mr. Ripley, which once again was also made into a movie. You probably have heard of that one. This version of the story takes the form of an 8-episode miniseries starring Andrew Scott, who absolutely kills it as Ripley. He is so perfectly creepy, but right on the edge of charming when he needs to be, in the role of this manipulative, strange, weird guy. It's yet another one where you're tempted to root for him because he is the protagonist. If you don't know the story of the talented Mr. Ripley, let's just say he gets up to some unsavory activities and may or may not be of interest to the police. And the bulk of the show revolves around this very entertaining cat and mouse game between him and other people who are looking for him, as he constantly has to invent more and more lies to get himself out of trouble. If you've ever played the video game Indigo Prophecy, as it's known in the United States, then you know there is an incredible opening scene in that game where you find yourself needing to cover up a murder and quickly hide all the evidence possible in your home before the police come and inspect everything. And it's this great tension as you're desperately working to make sure everything looks presentable. And that is the feeling I got in many scenes of this show. You can't help yourself, even if you understand that Ripley is kind of a despicable guy. You are just like, oh no, that one little thing poking out from under the rug, he forgot to cover it up. Ah! You'll make that sound. You will make that sound watching this show. The tension is awesome. And the cherry on top is the whole show is shot in black and white and takes place in Italy and looks absolutely gorgeous. The cinematography, the vistas that you are treated to throughout this show, the presentation is simply mwah, chef's kiss. Believe it or not, that means there's only one show left on my list. It's my absolute favorite new show that aired on TV in 2024. That show is Shogun. And wouldn't you know it, this is another one based on a book, and it was already a miniseries in the 80s. I'm not familiar with either of those. This was my first foray into this world. And to me, it's pretty obvious there was really no other contender for the number one spot on my list. This just is the best show of the year, hands down. It takes place in feudal Japan, and we mostly follow an English character who is thrust into this world. He's the fish out of water sort of audience surrogate, assuming you're not Japanese or from the feudal Japan era. And we see how he gets tangled up in the politics of the day. Now, one of the things that's so great about Shogun is that it bypasses the trap, the trope of making the one white guy who speaks English the main character of the show and the most important person in the show who saves the day. That's not who this guy is, and that's not what this show is, although he is a very central part of the story. There is a lot of focus on the actual Japanese characters. In fact, most of the show is in Japanese with English subtitles, which, I mean, of course it is. How else could they do it? But still, there is something impressive. It's kind of a relief that they were willing to do that. That is a bit of a risk on the part of the network, because there's plenty of people out there who would see that and not be interested in watching a show that was mostly not in English. And I'm very glad that they decided to do it the right way. If you're familiar with classic Japanese samurai movies, this show delivers a lot of that same kind of stuff that you probably love. Probably not surprising to anyone, but my actual historical knowledge of anything is very small because I am a moron. So please understand that it is based on nothing when I tell you that I do feel this show feels like it's more accurate to the time period than other samurai movies or shows perhaps are. They really go in depth on exactly how the political structure of the time operated, and the chain of command, and how you decide whether or not you're going to war and what that means, and how you might betray someone, and what happens when you have to put someone to death, or what happens when you decide you are going to commit seppuku, which happens a few times on the show, and every time it is an incredible, harrowing, upsetting moment to witness. There's also a great romance at the center of the show with the English character and Lady Mariko, who is one of the most badass characters ever to grace the television screen. I don't know what the budget for this show was either, but man, it looks incredible. It looks appropriately big, cinematic. There are villages and ships and battles and tons of extras all decked out in this authentic looking samurai gear. I will admit that when the show first began, I felt a little bit underwater in trying to figure out what was going on, but that's also what I love about the show, is that it just thrusts you into this world a lot like the main character of the show, so there is kind of that audience surrogate thing, but even given that, they really don't go out of their way to hand feed you exactly what's going on and who each character is and what their position is and how those positions work in this society. You do have to pay attention and learn those things and be willing to give it a little time for all of it to sink in. And then eventually you sort of start to feel like you are being absorbed into this culture, and things that maybe at first that you weren't familiar with, that seemed strange or confusing to you, by the end of the show, you're like, yeah, of course, that's how that goes. I understand. I'm part of this world. This all works out the way I expect it to. It's a really powerful show. It is absolutely the definition of must watch. They have already greenlit it for 2 more seasons, I think. And I don't know what that's going to look like, but if it's as good as this season, then this could end up being one of the all-time best shows that there ever was. It's Shogun, and it's my favorite from 2024. All right, those are the big guns, but I do have some follow-ups. 5, count them, 5 honorable mentions that didn't quite make my list, but I still want to shout them out. First up is Disclaimer. This is the new show by Alfonso Cuarón, a 6-episode or 7-episode mini-series about a couple and some things from their past that return to haunt them. Alfonso Cuarón is one of my favorite directors of all time. This is his first time doing television, I believe, and there is some great stuff in this show. The performances, the way that the story is unfurled, I thought was really engaging, especially towards the end. Not a complete home run, but I really enjoyed watching it, and I think it will probably age better over time when people go back and kind of re-examine this show a few years from now. A couple of comedies I really enjoyed: The Franchise and English Teacher. One is a total send-up of Marvel movies. It's partially from the guy who created Veep, so it has that vibe to it. A lot of great actors in that, and if you are familiar with Marvel movies, especially the behind-the-scenes machinations of them, you will get a big kick out of it. English Teacher is a great modern portrayal of a gay high school teacher who teaches in Texas, so there is, of course, some friction between him and the faculty and the parents and some of the kids even. It's played very well. It's very funny. I wish there were more episodes of this show, actually. It only has 8, and I feel like it wasn't quite enough room for it to really come into its own, but there are still some really hilarious moments on that one. Fallout is another show that I had a ton of fun with this year. I am not even close to a real fan of the video games. I have very little familiarity with them, but that didn't matter. I had a really fun time watching the show. I really loved all the actors, of course, including Walton Goggins, who's one of my favorites A very fun sci-fi show, and I think one of the better video game adaptations we've had in general. And finally, I also shout out Terminator Zero, which is an animated show produced in Japan, which is a spin-off of the original Terminator movie taking place in Japan, and the show is in Japanese. It is, for all intents and purposes, an anime based on Terminator, even though it was actually created by an American. Confusing, you can look into it. But this was a really cool show if you're a fan of Terminator lore. I thought they did some really neat stuff delving into the science fiction aspects and the time travel that I haven't really seen in any other Terminator adaptation. And that's my list. Like I said, I thought this was an excellent year for television. I don't know if it's just because I happened to hear about more of these shows, or I just happened to have more time to watch them for whatever reason. That can't be true because I have endless free time. I have no life. But at any rate, there were more shows this year than in most previous years that I feel like I really wanted to talk about. Let me know in those comments if you want, here on the YouTube. If you liked these shows as well, which one's your favorite? Anything that I left off that you were a big fan of? Anything that you would switch around? I don't know, talk to me if you want. And check out my top 10 movies from the past year as well. And who knows, maybe I'll even make one or two other YouTube videos this year before the next year's top 10 list. So go ahead and like and subscribe just in case. Bye.